So we've been talking about open source data, and throughout this session, but I want to dive down a little bit deeper. So how can your organization use open access data? Well, for one point, it can certainly inform your organization's work. You can determine the scope of the issue. You can identify the target, those who are most impacted by whatever issue that you're focusing on. But you can use open source data also to raise public awareness. You can use it to develop communication products that you may find useful to share with your constituents. I think those are particularly, some examples would be educational materials, newsletters, research brief, infographics, social media posts, etc. You can also use it to advance policy proposals. So many of the NGOs in Belize are focused on addressing policy issues, and so you can highlight a key issue to public official. Open access data can be used to inform your organization's work, and that's something that you should keep in mind. Key figures and statistics can help raise awareness among members of the public and among policy makers and the issues that your organization is most concerned about. So certainly you should take into account the possibility of using open access data. Next slide, please. Perhaps this may seem obvious to some of you, but maybe not all of the points that I'd like to make. So why do your organizations matter? Some of you have decided to start an NGO because you've noticed a particular issue and you want to address that issue, but there's some things that are unique to community and civil society organizations around the world, and I think you should take note of that. So for one, you have you're the bridge that goes between the end users and the community members. So you are that person who serves as a liaison to communicate activities, and communicate issues, whatever they may be. You're an advocate for resources and for policies. So when you see a problem, you can begin to generate interest, discussion around the particular issue and raise awareness about it. You can elevate voices of affected populations. Later today, you'll hear from, for example, the Belize Assembly for People with Diverse Abilities. This is a great example. Monitoring and accountability, and here I'm talking about government accountability and transparency. Your agency can serve to be the watchdog, to reach out and make aware the issues that are most important for whatever your cause may be. You can also be very important in the processes of implementation. So your particular NGO may provide a service of some sort. You may do, or you may be monitoring the service of some sort. You can help facilitate that, be a voice that can help move the needle in whatever topic that you're addressing. And that's especially important. You can become a producer of research, not only a consumer of research. And what we mean by that is we want you to be able to think about open data, to access that data and use it towards your ends. Anytime that you have data backed up by facts and figures, I think that it's more persuasive and can offer a more compelling argument to whatever your issue is. Your agency may also be seeking to provide technical assistance. One way you can do that is through being well informed, gathering information. You can help develop the policies and procedures and the behaviors, the services that you would like to see. And I think that's especially important. You can also work to develop innovative financing mechanisms. And later today, there's going to be a workshop that specifically addresses that. And linked to that is the idea of creating public and private partnerships. Funding is a perpetual problem, and being able to find a way to sustain your interest and to advance the goals of your NGO are critical. And I know there's been quite a bit of interest in fundraising, et cetera, in the chat. So let's talk more about that as we go on. Finally, providing services and community engagement in places the government is unable to reach. Nowhere is that more important than Belize. It's a rural community, the majority of Belize is rural, and there are many areas that are outside of the reach of government. And so NGOs stand in the gap to fill that need. And it's a very important part of of a continuum of services in country. Finally, you provide an essential oversight role in holding decision makers accountable. And here we're talking about lawmakers and policymakers and those who need to hear from you, need to understand better the conditions in which you work. Next slide. So a couple of points, and this may seem very basic, even remedial, but I think it's one that many agencies fail to do well. You need to be clear about your mission. write a mission statement. And I'm sure all of you already have a mission statement, but I urge you to go back and think about it. Say it out loud. Does it really capture what you want to do? Express your core purpose for existing. You should think about what drives you. What issue are you working to address, and why? Why does your work try to help? How does it try to help? Who does it try to help? Think about the actions that you take. What specifically will you do to address the issues that drive your work? So often I'm interested, I meet NGO administrators, et cetera, and they'll say, well, we're focused on X. But then I say, well, what are you doing to get to where you want to be? Oftentimes that part is underdeveloped. So think about the actual steps that you will do. In impact, what real world effects or difference can your work make on the issue? And that's really important. So don't bite off more than you can chew, but certainly don't minimize what you can achieve. Identify your audience. So as I mentioned a bit ago, that you could become producers of research. Who are you developing research for? What do you want to share? Your audience could be, like I said, policymakers, et cetera, but it could also be the public at large. It could be other NGOs. It could be a host of different individuals, but you should think about who your audience is. And also identify collaborators and consider alliances. There's no reason for you to recreate the wheel. There are NGOs with far more experience. There may be NGOs who are working in the same area. Perhaps you can collaborate and look for opportunities to do that. Data sources, data sources, data sources. We've shared a few examples today. The Latin American Public Opinion Poll could be, project could be useful to some of you. JIC data might be useful to some of you. BCO data might be useful. Certainly SIV data will be useful. Think about what else you need to access. And then identify a dissemination strategy. Think about what will make your research most accessible to your identified audience, and that's a critical component. So you need to have a well-developed communication and dissemination strategy. My colleague, Amanda Whitwer, is going to pick up here and talk for a few more minutes about some of the open data sources that she's identified and some other details related to developing solid communication products. Amanda.
Am I unmuted? I think I am. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Whitwer. I work with Chris, Wayne, and Renata at RTI International. I'm so glad that you all were able to join us today. We're very excited to be talking with you a little bit about open data. Now that we've talked a little bit about what open source data is exactly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some sources of open source data in Belize, and also really quickly go through a potential application for that data, so how your organization might consider using that information. Shane, if you could go to the next slide for me. If we could just jump real quick to the next slide, Shane. Thank you. So we have talked a little bit about some of these sources of data, and so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But as we've heard, the Police Crime Observatory is a great source of data. They publish statistics on major crime rates at the district level. Their information is published on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis, and it's updated very frequently. So you may log in one day and log in maybe a week later and find something new. They post resources very frequently. There's also some information on the Central Bank of Belize's website. They've got a rates and statistics page where you can download some Excel spreadsheets with some information about some key economic indicators. And in addition to data that comes in the form of numbers in a spreadsheet, there's also some other open source data out there and available. So for example, the Belize Tourism Board and the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry regularly publish publications, reports that have some key metrics that they track in the form of graphs or potentially written out in paragraph format. But in any case, that information can be incredibly useful, and it's very easy to pull from those sources and use that data. Shane, if you could pop over to the next slide for me. I won't spend too much time on this. I know we've had a great presentation on the Statistical Institute of Belize, but just to reiterate, it is a fantastic repository of open source data. They have a lot of information available on so many topics we couldn't possibly talk about all of them. I think the really exciting thing about SIB's data is that not only can you download it as an Excel sheet, but you can also find a wealth of resources that have analyzed that data. So there are research reports, there are brochures, infographics, videos, anything that you could think of about how you could analyze this data is freely available on SIB's website. And if we could go to the next slide. In addition to national sources of open source data, there are also some international organizations and agencies that regularly collect and compile various types of data. We've talked about a few of them. So LA POP is one of those resources. There's also the United Nations and UNESCO. There's various branches of the United Nations that collect and publish data on Belize. So for example, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations has some data available online. And if we could pop over to the next slide. Now that we've talked a little bit about the open source data ecosystem, if you will, in Belize, I'm going to talk a little bit about some applications for that data to build off of Wayne's presentation. I think if you were joining earlier, you may have seen one of these other research briefs. RTI, BAP, and our partners have been developing some deliverables that just illustrate some of the ways that this information can be used, particularly in a policy context. So what you're seeing on this slide here is a research brief that I developed on the potential impact of COVID-19 on tourism in Belize. And I'm just going to walk through really quickly my process for pulling this together. So if we could jump over to the next slide. So to start off, I was thinking about topics that might be of interest to members of the general public, but also to policymakers. And I settled on the potential impact of COVID on the tourism industry, since tourism is such a large sector in Belize, and there was quite a lot of media attention to the topic at the time. Once I had settled on a topic, I did sort of an informal scan of what data sources were out there and available to pull in and use for this brief. And what I found is that there was some great information about the economic contributions of tourism published by the Central Bank of Belize. The Belize Tourism Board has some tourism statistics that they have been collecting every year for quite some time. So it's great for longitudinal analysis. And there is also some information from the SIB about the percentage of the labor force that's involved in tourism related jobs. I complemented that with some news coverage, what would be considered secondary data on the COVID-19 measures that were put into place to try to limit its spread, especially those related to travel. If we want to pop over to the next slide. So to get started on this brief, I wrote up a really quick introduction to just introduce the topic, and then made use of that open source data to do kind of a high level summary of the state of tourism in Belize as a whole, just to provide some context for the topic of the brief. So on that right-hand side, it's a little small. Sorry if you can't read the numbers, but that is a little graphic that shows you tourism revenue as the blue bars, and then tourism arrivals. So individual arrivals is that little orange line. And the idea was just to illustrate that the tourism sector has been growing rapidly over the last 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, and just provide some context for talking about COVID and what impact it may have on tourism and the economy as a whole. So if we want to pop over to the next slide. And then having established that context, I wrote up a couple of paragraphs making use of that news coverage to talk a little bit about what the impact of public health crises like COVID generally are for economies, and specifically for tourism. I made reference to some articles that had talked a little bit about the impact of the Zika outbreak from a couple of years ago on tourism, and then talked a little bit about some of the measures that have been put into place. And potentially what their impact might be for tourism. Really, my goal for this brief was just to say there are some really great data sources out there on tourism, and it will be really important to continue to monitor those data trends with those data sources to see where COVID takes us and where we come out on the other end. And if we want to pop over to the next slide. And to finish out this brief, I wanted to make sure to cite the data sources that I used, not only so that readers could replicate my analyses and double check my work, but also so that if they had additional questions on the topic, they could pop into that data and take a look at it. And there would be an opportunity to continue to monitor these indicators so that if we do see a drop in tourism, it's easier to track those trends and respond accordingly. And then of course below, we've got some basic references for all of that information.